Imagine standing on a heaving wooden deck, watching the only home you have ever known vanish behind a wall of gray mist. The air is cold and damp against your skin. The smell of the harbor with its tar and brine is slowly being replaced by the crisp, clean scent of the open ocean. You grip the rough timber of the railing. Your knuckles turn white. You know that ahead of you lies an ocean that swallows ships whole. There is no turning back now. The land is gone. The safety of the shore is a memory. You are alone in the vast emptiness of the Atlantic. We are stepping aboard the Mayflower, not as it sits in a museum, but as it groans under the weight of supplies and anxious souls. It is ready to cast off into the unknown history of 1620. We are here to witness the grit and the fear and the hope. If you enjoy these journeys into the past, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to our growing community. I would love to know, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it for you right now? It is wonderful to have you here, so settle into your pillows, pull the covers up tight. Let the modern world fade away. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight, we join a band of travelers on a voyage that would define a nation, beginning with the first creak of the anchor chain. Tonight, we join a band of travelers on a voyage that would define a nation, beginning with the first creak of the anchor chain. The story of this voyage does not begin on the water. It begins with a divide. The passengers huddled together on the deck were not all of one mind or one heart. In the history books, we call them pilgrims. But amongst themselves, they saw two very different groups. There were the saints, and there were the strangers. The saints were the separatists. They were the religious motivators of this journey. They were men and women who believed that the Church of England was beyond repair. They sought a purity of worship that they could not find in their homeland. For years, many of them had lived in Leiden, in Holland. It was a city of canals and brick buildings and tolerance, but it was not home. In Leiden, life was hard. They worked in cloth trades. They struggled to make ends meet. But the greater fear was not poverty. It was assimilation. They watched their children speaking Dutch. They watched them adopting Dutch customs. They feared that in a generation or two their distinct identity would dissolve into the culture around them. They were losing their English heritage. To preserve their faith and their culture, they had to leave. They had to find a place where they could be English and separate all at once. But faith alone does not buy ships. Faith does not purchase salted beef or barrels of beer or gunpowder. To cross the ocean, they needed money. Lots of it. They entered into a difficult agreement with the merchant adventurers of London. These were investors, men of business, who cared little for prayer and everything for profit. The investors put up the capital. In exchange, the settlers pledged their labor for 7 years. It was a harsh contract. It felt almost like servitude. To make the venture profitable, the investors insisted on filling the ship. The saints were not numerous enough to fill a vessel on their own. So the investors recruited others. These were the strangers. They were common English folk. They were not leaving for religious freedom. They were leaving for land. They were leaving for opportunity. They were escaping a Europe where the gap between rich and poor was an uncrossable chasm. Among these travelers, there were key figures who would hold the fragile group together. There was William Bradford. He was a young man of deep conviction. He would become the chronicler of their hardships. There was William Brewster. He was an older man, a father figure to the group. He carried the spiritual weight of the community on his shoulders. And because they were heading into a wilderness, they needed iron as well as prayer. They hired Miles Standish. He was a soldier, a man of war, among men of peace. He was short in stature, with fiery red hair and a temper to match. He was not a member of their church, but he knew how to organize a defense. He knew how to handle a musket. In the wild lands of the New World, his knowledge would be more valuable than gold. Their destination was not the rocky coast of New England. The charter they held was for the northern parts of Virginia, near the Hudson River. It was a place that promised a milder climate, but getting there was the challenge. They knew they were racing against the calendar. The Atlantic storm season was approaching. Every day they wasted in port was a day closer to the winter gales. The fear of the ocean was compounded by the fear of men. The high seas were not safe. The conflict between England and Spain was always simmering. The Spanish menace was real. Spanish warships patrolled the waters. If they were captured, the men would be sent to the galleys as slaves or worse. The women and children would face terrible fates, and they had no official protection from the crown. King James I had refused to give them an official charter. He granted them only a tacit tolerance. He would not hunt them down, but he would not protect them either. They were on their own. You can imagine the atmosphere in those final days before departure. The waiting halls in Southampton smelled of damp wool and nervous perspiration. The air was thick with the sound of goodbyes. The saints had arrived from Holland. They heard the sound of Dutch cobblestones give way to the wooden thud of English docks. It was a jarring transition. They were back in the land that had rejected them, only to leave it again. There was the scratching of quill pens on predatory loan contracts. The investors squeezed every last penny from them. At the last moment, they demanded changes to the agreement. The travelers were desperate. They signed away their rights just to get on board. Families packed their entire lives into small wooden chests, a favorite cooking pot, a family Bible, a warm blanket. These few objects were the only bridges between their old lives and the new mystery awaiting them. In secret meetings held in the shadows of the warehouses, they whispered their prayers. They asked for safety. They asked for strength. The hush of their voices was heavy with the knowledge of the risk. They were risking everything, their lives, their fortunes, their families. With the contracts signed and the passengers gathered, the reality of the ships themselves became the first obstacle. The plan was simple on paper. They would take two ships, the Speedwell and the Mayflower. The Speedwell was a smaller ship. It was a pinnace of 60 tons. The Saints had purchased it. The idea was that the Speedwell would cross the ocean with them and then stay in the colony too, serve as a fishing boat and a trading vessel. It was their lifeline. The Mayflower was hired only to transport them and then return to England. The Mayflower was a different beast entirely. She was a merchant ship, a cargo hauler. For years, she had sailed the trade routes to France, bringing wine back to London. This was a stroke of luck for the passengers. Many ships of that era hauled garbage or wool or hides. They smelled of rot and decay. But the Mayflower was a sweet ship. The seeped wine had soaked into her oak timbers over the years. She smelled faintly of vinegar and grapes. It was a small mercy in a world of harsh odors. Her captain was Master Christopher Jones. He was not an explorer like Drake or Raleigh. He was a prudent, seasoned merchant captain. He was a part owner of the ship. He knew the waters of Europe well, but he had never crossed the Atlantic. This was a new venture for him, too. He looked at his ship, and he looked at the passengers, and he calculated the risks. The trouble began almost immediately, and it began with the Speedwell. The smaller ship had been refitted in Holland, but as soon as they set out into the channel, the speedwell began to leak. It was not just a trickle. Water poured into the hold. The pumps clanked day and night. The sailors grumbled. They said the ship was cursed. Some historians believe it was sabotage. The crew of the speedwell had signed a contract to stay in America for a year. It is possible they had cold feet. They may have overmasted the ship, using a mainsail that was too large. This would strain the hull when the wind blew, opening the seams and letting the water in. When they took the pressure off the mast, the leaking stopped. But the passengers did not know this. They only saw the water rising. Twice they turned back. First they put into Dartmouth. The carpenters searched the hull. They caulked the seams. They hammered and patched. The passengers waited. They ate into their precious food supplies. They lost the fair winds of August. When they set out again, the leaking returned. It was worse this time. They were 300 miles past Land's End when the captain of the speedwell signaled distress. They had to turn back again. This time they limped into Plymouth. The frustration was agonizing. Imagine watching the coastline reappear after you have already said your tearful goodbyes. Imagine the emotional whiplash. You have steeled yourself for the voyage, and now you are back in the mud of an English port. The children were crying, confused by the false starts. The leaders were arguing. The investors were furious. A heartbreaking decision had to be made. The speedwell was deemed unfit for the ocean. It could not make the voyage. They would have to leave it behind. But the Mayflower could not hold everyone. There were too many people. Some would have to stay. It was a moment of terrible sorrow. Families had to split. About 20 passengers volunteered to return to London. Among them was Robert Cushman, a key organizer who was sick and exhausted by the stress. They moved the cargo from the speedwell to the Mayflower. It was a chaotic shuffling of boxes and barrels. The Mayflower was already full. Now it was being stuffed to the bursting point. Supplies were crammed into every corner. The ship sat lower in the water. It felt heavy and sluggish. The date was September 6, 1620. This was dangerously late. The window for a safe crossing had closed weeks ago. The autumn storms were gathering in the North Atlantic. The gray clouds on the western horizon looked ominous. They were not just clouds, they were warnings. But they could not wait any longer. If they did not leave now, they would lose their financing. They would lose everything. So with 102 passengers and about 30 crew members crammed into a ship just 100 feet long, they cast off. The loss of precious wind and time during the delays had cost them dearly. The financial drain of eating their own provisions while sitting in port meant they were starting the journey with less food than they planned. But they were finally moving. With the coast of England finally fading for the last time, the travelers faced their new reality, which was the open ocean. With the contracts signed and the passengers gathered, the reality of the ships themselves became the first obstacle. But now the physical reality of the ship became their entire world. Let us look at where they lived. Let us look at the architecture of their confinement. The passengers were confined to the gun deck. This was the area between the main deck above and the cargo hold below. It was often called the 'tween decks. If you are imagining a spacious hall, you must banish that thought. It was a low, dark cavern. The ceiling was barely 5 feet high. A grown man could not stand up straight. For the entire voyage, he would have to walk with a stoop. His back would ache constantly. The taller men learned to navigate by crouching, moving like crabs in the dim light. There was no privacy, none. This was a time before private cabins for common folk. The space was one large, open room. To create some semblance of order, families hung sheets of canvas or old sailcloth. These flimsy partitions were all that separated a family from their neighbors. You could hear everything. A baby crying 3 rooms away sounded like it was in your lap. A couple arguing in whispers could be heard by everyone. The lack of privacy created a simmering tension. There was no escape from the gaze or the sound of others. The high-ranking officers and Captain Jones lived in the great cabin at the stern of the ship. It had windows. It had a table. It was a different world compared to the 'tween decks. But even their space was tight. Below the passengers was the orlop deck. This was a dark, damp place below the waterline where the cables and dry goods were stored. It was the domain of the rats and the ship's cat. Sanitation was a nightmare. There were no bathrooms. There were only chamber pots and buckets. In the rough seas, these often spilled. The smell in the 'tween decks was a mixture of unwashed bodies and waste and stale air. The air grew thicker with every passing day. There was no ventilation. The hatches were often battened down to keep the sea spray out. This sealed the bad air inside. It was a stagnant, humid atmosphere that clung to the skin. The Mayflower was a merchant ship, but she was armed. The gun deck where the passengers slept was also the battery. There were cannons lashed to the sides of the ship, big iron guns designed to fight off pirates or the Spanish. The passengers had to sleep around these massive metal beasts. They were constant reminders of the violence of the world they were trying to escape. Space was further restricted by the shallop. This was a smaller boat used for exploring shallow waters. It was too big to tow behind the ship across the ocean, so they had cut it into pieces and stored it in the 'tween decks. The passengers were literally sleeping on top of the dismantled boat. It took up precious floor space where people could have stretched out. Cooking was almost impossible. Fire is the greatest danger on a wooden ship. A single spark could turn the Mayflower into a torch in the middle of the ocean. When the weather was calm, they might light a small fire in a metal box on the upper deck to cook a stew. But for most of the voyage, the weather was too rough. Fires were forbidden. This meant they ate cold food, day after day. Hardtack, which is a dry, rock-hard biscuit. Cheese that was slowly going moldy. Salted beef that had to be soaked to be edible. Dried peas. There was nothing warm to comfort the stomach. And then there was the motion. The constant, relentless motion. The ship did not just move forward. It rolled from side to side. It pitched from front to back. It yawed and shuddered. The 'tween decks were dark, lit only by dim lanterns that swung wildly with the ship's movement. The shadows danced on the timber walls, making the space feel like a living beast. The tactile sensation was one of dampness. The wood never truly dried. Everything you touched felt clammy. The condensation dripped from the ceiling beams. The discomfort of the living quarters was manageable in calm waters, but the Atlantic was about to wake up. The first weeks of the voyage offered a deceptive calm. They had what sailors call a fair wind. The breeze blew steadily from the east, pushing them along at a good clip. The sun broke through the clouds occasionally. For a moment the passengers might have thought that their prayers had been answered and the crossing would be easy. But this was a trap. The human body is not designed for the ocean. As the ship moved into the long rolling swells of the Atlantic, the seasickness began. It hit almost everyone. The landlubbers, as the sailors called them, had no sea legs. Their inner ears were in revolt. It started with a headache, then a cold sweat, then the nausea. It was a profound misery. In the 17th century, they did not understand the medical cause of motion sickness. They believed it was a purging of the body's humors. They thought the body was trying to expel bad fluids, so they let it happen. Dr. Samuel Fuller was the physician for the passengers. He was a good man, but there was little he could do. He moved among the sick, trying to offer comfort. But how do you comfort 100 people who are all vomiting at once in a sealed room? The sour, acrid smell of sickness pervaded the 'tween decks. It soaked into the wood. It was inescapable. The crew of the Mayflower was a mixed bunch. Some were professional and indifferent. Others were cruel. There was one young boatswain in particular who took a twisted delight in the Pilgrims' suffering. He was a strong, profane man. He would mock them as they leaned over the rails or retched into their buckets. He cursed them daily. He told them that he hoped to cast half of them overboard before the journey was done. He said he would make merry with their possessions once they were dead. He was a source of terror for the gentle separatists. But history has a strange sense of irony. This young man who boasted of his strength and mocked the weak was the first to die. He was struck by a sudden, grievous disease. It came on fast. Within days he was delirious, and then he was gone. The crew sewed his body into a shroud and committed him to the deep. The passengers saw this as the hand of God. It was a grim justice, but it quieted the other sailors. They began to look at the passengers with a little more wariness and perhaps a little more respect. Life on board settled into a grim routine. The ship ran on a shift system, for hours on watch, for hours off. The ship's bell rang every half hour, marking the passage of time. For the passengers down in the dark, it was the only way to know if it was day or night. They lived in a twilight state. The sensory world had changed completely. The smell of land was gone. The smell of pine and earth and smoke was replaced by the sharp, metallic taste of salt spray. The salt coated everything. It made your skin itch. It made your hair stiff. It crusted on your lips. Psychologically, the transition was immense. The excitement of the departure had worn off. The adrenaline was gone. Now there was only endurance. They had to endure the rolling, endure the smell, endure the cold food, endure the fear. They were suspended between two worlds. The world they had left behind was gone forever. The world they were going to was just a dream. All that existed was the wooden shell of the ship and the gray water. The rhythmic groaning of the ship's timbers became the soundtrack of their lives. Every time the ship climbed a wave, the wood creaked. Every time it slid down the other side, it groaned. It sounded like the ship was in pain, and in a way it was. The Atlantic was testing it. But these initial sicknesses were merely the body adjusting. Soon the ship itself would be tested by the fury of the deep Atlantic. As we sail further from the safety of the shore, I wonder what other great journeys or expeditions into the unknown would you like to hear us explore? Perhaps a trek across the Silk Road in the time of merchants and khans, or maybe a voyage to the Arctic where the ice sings in the night. Let me know in the comments below. The fair winds that had carried the Mayflower away from the coast of England were a deception. They were a gentle hand guiding the travelers into a trap. As September bled into October, the mood of the ocean changed. The sky, which had been a vast open blue, began to lower itself. It turned the color of bruised iron. The air grew heavy and charged with a strange energy. These were the equinoctial gales, the time of year when the seasons clash and the Atlantic releases its pent-up fury. The transition was not sudden. It began with the wind shifting. For weeks it had pushed them from behind. Now it swung around and began to beat against the bow. The ship slowed. The sails, which had been full and white and proud, now flapped uselessly or had to be furled tight against the yards. And then the waves began to build. It is difficult for us to comprehend the size of an Atlantic storm wave from the safety of dry land. We think of waves crashing on a beach, but out in the deep ocean, where the water is miles deep, the waves are mountains. They rose 30, sometimes 40 or 50 feet into the air. Imagine a 4-story building made of moving water towering over you. And then imagine that building collapsing on top of a small wooden shell. The Mayflower was a merchant ship. She was broad and strong, but she was small. Against these waves, she was nothing more than a chip of wood. The captain, Master Jones, made a desperate decision. He ordered the crew to take in all the sails. Every scrap of canvas was stripped from the masts. They lashed the helm so the rudder would not swing wildly, and then they simply let the ship drift. This tactic is called lying hull, a hull. It was a surrender to the elements. Without sails, the ship could not be steered. It simply wallowed in the troughs of the waves. It rolled violently from side to side. For the passengers below decks, this was the beginning of a true nightmare. The sound was the first thing that broke their spirits. The wind did not just blow, it screamed. Sailors call it the devil's flute, image of 17th century ship rigging in storm. When the wind hits the rigging, the ropes vibrate and sing a high, piercing note that sets the teeth on edge. It is a sound that penetrates everything. Even deep in the hold, with your hands over your ears, you could hear the ship screaming. And then came the water. The Mayflower was being tossed so violently that the seams in the upper deck began to open. The oakum caulking that sealed the planks worked loose. Water did not just spray, it poured. It cascaded down from the ceiling of the 'tween decks, soaking the passengers. The bedding was soaked. The food sacks were soaked. The people were soaked. And they could not dry off. The temperature plummeted. The warm air of early autumn was gone, replaced by the biting cold of the North Atlantic. Without fire, there was no heat. The passengers huddled together for warmth, their breath forming clouds in the dim light. But they could not see the clouds because it was pitch black. During the height of the storm, lighting a lantern was too dangerous. If the ship lurched and a lantern smashed, the oil could ignite. A fire in a storm is a death sentence. So they sat in absolute darkness. The only light came when a hatch was briefly opened and a flash of lightning illuminated the terrified faces. The sensation of movement was terrifying. When the ship climbed the face of a giant wave, there was a crushing sensation of gravity. You felt heavy, pressed into the floor. And then, as the ship crested the peak and began to slide down the other side, there was a sickening moment of weightlessness. Your stomach rose into your throat. You felt as if you were falling down a mine shaft. And then the ship would hit the bottom of the trough with a bone-jarring crash that threw people against the walls. The animals were panicking. The goats and chickens and pigs, stored in pens, were screaming. Their terror added to the cacophony. The smell in the 'tween decks changed. It was no longer just the smell of sickness. It was the smell of ozone from the lightning and the sharp metallic smell of sheer terror. In the midst of this chaos, a catastrophe occurred that nearly ended the expedition entirely. It happened during one of the most violent lurches. A sound echoed through the ship that was louder than the wind and louder than the waves. It was a sharp, explosive crack like a cannon shot. The ship shuddered. The sailors on deck froze. The passengers below screamed. The main beam amidships had cracked. This was the spine of the ship. It was a massive timber running across the width of the vessel, holding the sides together and supporting the weight of the main deck. The immense pressure of the waves battering the hull had caused it to buckle. It was bowed and cracked. This was a critical failure. If the beam gave way completely, the upper deck would collapse, crushing the passengers. The sides of the ship would implode inward. The Mayflower would be gone in minutes. Panic set in. The captain and the officers gathered to inspect the damage. They looked at the splintered wood with grim faces. There was a heated debate. Some of the officers said they must turn back. They argued that the ship was too weak to continue. They were closer to England than America. Why risk death for a dream? But the Pilgrims were adamant. They had come too far. They believed that God was testing them, but faith alone could not fix a broken beam. They needed engineering, and miraculously they had brought the solution with them. Among the cargo belonging to the passengers was a heavy piece of iron equipment. Some records say it was part of a printing press destined for the new colony. Others say it was a great iron screw used for raising houses. Whatever it was a massive, threaded iron jack. The passengers dragged this heavy iron object out of the hold. Imagine the scene. The ship is rolling violently. The floor is slick with water. Men are slipping and sliding, struggling to move this heavy, cold piece of metal. They positioned it directly under the cracked beam. They placed a block of wood on top of it to spread the load, and then they began to turn the screw. It was a grinding metallic sound. Slowly, painfully, the iron screw extended. It pushed up against the sagging timber. The wood groaned as it was forced back into place. The men sweated in the freezing cold, their muscles straining as they turned the handle. Inch by inch, the beam was lifted until it was level again. To keep it there, they found a strong post and wedged it firmly between the deck and the beam. The screw had done its job. The beam was shored up. The ship held. The relief was physical. A collective sigh went through the 'tween decks. Master Jones, the captain, looked at the repair and looked at the passengers with a new respect. These were not just helpless religious fanatics. They were prepared. They were resilient. They had brought the very tool that saved their lives. The carpenters went to work caulking the upper decks to stop the worst of the leaks. They nailed canvas over the openings. The ship was wounded, but she was still floating. They realized then that they had passed the point of no return. The ocean behind them was just as dangerous as the ocean ahead. They had to go on. The ship held together, but the ocean had one more test for the passengers, specifically for a young man named John Howland. John Howland was not one of the saints. He was an indentured servant, a young man in his 20s, attached to the household of John Carver. He was lusty and strong, and perhaps a bit reckless. After days of being cooped up in the foul air of the 'tween decks, he could take it no longer. The air below was unbreathable. He needed to breathe. He climbed the ladder to the main deck. It was a foolish move. The storm was still raging. The deck was awash with freezing water. The ship was pitching wildly. As soon as he stepped out from the shelter of the hatch, the ship took a massive roll to the leeward side. John lost his footing. He slid across the wet planks. There was nothing to grab. He hit the rail and tumbled over it. In an instant, he was gone. He fell into the boiling gray ocean. The shock of the water was instantaneous. The Atlantic in October is freezing. It hits the body like a physical blow. The air is punched out of your lungs. Your muscles seize up. John Howland was submerged. He went down deep. The roar of the wind was replaced by the muffled silence of the underwater world. Most men would have died then, weighted down by heavy wool clothing in freezing water. With a ship moving away from them, survival was impossible. But John Howland had luck, or perhaps destiny, on his side. As he fell, he had flailed his arms. His hand struck a rope trailing in the water. It was the topsail halyard, a long rope used to hoist the sails. It had washed overboard in the confusion. John grabbed it. He gripped it with the desperate strength of a dying man. He was dragged underwater. The ship was still moving, drifting with the wind. He was pulled through the depths, fathoms deep. The water filled his nose and ears. His lungs burned. But he did not let go. On the deck, the sailors saw the rope go tight. They hauled on it. They pulled hand over hand, straining against the weight of the man and the drag of the water. Slowly, John Howland broke the surface. He was gasping, coughing up seawater. They used boathooks to snag his clothes and haul him over the rail. He flopped onto the deck like a landed fish, blue with cold and shivering violently. He was alive. They rushed him below. They stripped off his freezing clothes and wrapped him in warm blankets. Dr. Fuller checked his lungs, fearing the lung fever that often follows near drowning. But John Howland was made of tough stuff. He recovered. It was a moment that changed him. He had seen the other side. He had felt the cold embrace of the abyss and returned. This sea change marked him. He would go on to become one of the most important leaders of the Plymouth colony. He would live to be 80 years old and leave behind a massive family line. But on that day, he was just a shivering, wet young man who realized how thin the line is between life and death. With Howland safe and the storms eventually subsiding, a new enemy emerged: the crushing weight of time and monotony. The violent fury of the storms gave way to a long, slow misery. The voyage was taking much longer than anticipated. It would drag on for 66 days. That is over 2 months of living in a wooden box. As the weeks wore on, the supplies began to fail. The water stored in the barrels went bad. It turned slimy and green with algae. It smelled foul. It was unsafe to drink. The passengers had to rely on beer. Even the children drank beer. It was the only liquid that was safe because the alcohol killed the bacteria. The food deteriorated. The hardtack biscuits, which had been rock hard in Southampton, were now soft and infested. Weevil's little beetles had hatched in the grain. The passengers had to tap the biscuits on the table to knock the bugs out before eating, or they simply ate them in the dark and tried not to think about the crunch. But life continued to assert itself even in the wasteland of the ocean. In the crowded, damp 'tween decks, a miracle happened. Elizabeth Hopkins, wife of Stephen Hopkins, went into labor. Imagine giving birth on a rolling ship in a storm, with no privacy, surrounded by strangers. It seems impossible. And yet, amidst the groaning of the timbers and the smell of the sea, a baby boy was born. They named him Oceanus Hopkins, a child of the sea. His first breath was salty air. His first cradle was a rocking ship. He was a symbol of hope, a sign that life could flourish even here. But where there is life, there is also death. As the journey neared its end, tragedy struck. William Button was a young servant to Dr. Samuel Fuller. He had endured the storms. He had endured the sickness, but his body gave out. He died just days before they sighted land. It was a cruel timing. He had survived the entire crossing, only to fade away within sight of the finish line. They committed his body to the deep, a somber reminder that the ocean exacts a toll. Navigation became a guessing game. For days on end, the sky was covered in a thick blanket of gray clouds. The pilot could not see the sun by day or the stars by night. He had to rely on dead reckoning, guessing their speed and direction. They were drifting in a gray void. Scurvy began to appear. It is a terrible disease caused by a lack of vitamin C. The passengers' gums began to swell and bleed. Their teeth became loose. Mysterious dark spots appeared on their skin. Their joints ached. It was a slow rotting of the body from the inside out. They needed fresh food. They needed land. And then the signs began to appear. The color of the water changed. It shifted from the deep ink blue of the abyss to a lighter, greener shade. Floating driftwood appeared pieces of branches and leaves that could only come from a forest. The passengers crowded the rails. They suffered from land fever. They would stare at the horizon and shout that they saw mountains, only to realize it was just a cloud bank. The disappointment was crushing. They turned to prayer. Every morning and every evening the sound of psalm singing filled the ship. It was a haunting, beautiful sound, 100 voices raised against the vast silence of the ocean. It was the only thing that kept them sane. They were exhausted. Their bodies were broken. Their clothes were rags. They smelled. They were hungry, but they were still moving. Then, on the morning of November 9th, the call finally came down from the crow's nest. It was a cry that cut through the wind and the weariness. It was the cry they had been dreaming of for 66 nights. It is hard for us to imagine, in our world of instant travel, a journey of 66 days where the horizon never changes. I would love to hear your thoughts. Could you have endured 2 months in the dark hull of the Mayflower? Or would the isolation have been too much? On the morning of November 9th, 1620, the world changed. It did not change with a shout or a cannon blast, but with a simple shift in the light. For 66 days, the horizon had been a relentless line where the gray sky met the gray sea. It was a prison of water. But on this morning, as the dawn light filtered through the mist, the lookout in the crow's nest saw something different. It was a dark, uneven shape rising from the water. It was not a cloud. It was solid. It was land. The cry of land ho rang out. It was a sound that electric current through the weary passengers. They scrambled up the ladders from the dark 'tween decks. They poured onto the main deck, blinking in the morning light, and there it was, the Cape Cod Highlands. High sandy cliffs topped with a crown of dark trees. Tears streamed down faces that were hardened by salt and wind. Men fell to their knees in prayer. Children were lifted up to see the miracle. It was the most beautiful thing they had ever seen. It was not just land, it was life. It was the promise that the rocking would stop. It was the promise of fresh water and solid ground. But as the initial euphoria faded, a realization set in. They were looking at the long hooked arm of Cape Cod. They were far north of their intended destination. Their charter was for the Hudson River Territory, which was much further south. They were effectively lost, or at least they were not where they were supposed to be. Master Jones consulted his charts. He decided to turn the ship south. He would try to sail down the coast to find the Hudson. The passengers agreed. They wanted to be within their legal rights. So the Mayflower turned her bow south and began to coast along the outer arm of the cape. But the ocean was not done with them yet. As they sailed south, the water began to change. It grew turbulent. The smooth swells of the open ocean were replaced by chopping, violent waves. They heard the roar of breakers. They had stumbled into the Pollock Rip. This is a dangerous stretch of water where the ocean floor rises up in shifting shoals. The currents swirl and clash. The Mayflower was suddenly in peril of running aground. If they hit the sandbanks out here in the open ocean, the ship would be pounded to pieces by the surf. The wind began to die, leaving them drifting toward the white water. Fear returned. The joy of the morning evaporated. It seemed cruel to bring them within sight of land, only to wreck them on the doorstep. But just as they were bracing for the impact, the wind shifted. It blew fresh and strong from the south. It was as if a giant hand had reached down to turn them away from danger. Master Jones wasted no time. He spun the wheel. The ship came about. They turned their backs on the Hudson and sailed north again, away from the deadly shoals. They would settle in New England. By the next day they had rounded the tip of the Cape and sailed into the calm waters of what is now Provincetown Harbor. The difference was profound. Inside the hook of the Cape, the water was flat and glassy. The ship stopped rolling. The constant creaking and groaning of the timbers ceased. For the first time in 2 months, there was silence. They dropped the anchor. The heavy iron splash echoed across the bay. The chain rattled out and held fast in the sandy bottom. They were safe. The passengers stood at the rail and just breathed. The wind blowing off the land carried a scent that was intoxicating. It did not smell of salt. It smelled of juniper. It smelled of cedar and pine. It smelled of rotting leaves and wet earth. It was the perfume of a wild, untouched continent. They looked out at the shore. It was described in their journals as a goodly land and wooded to the brink of the sea. There were no ports. There were no stone castles. There were no church spires or chimney smoke. There was only the green wall of the forest and the white ribbon of the beach. It was wilder than anything they had ever known. In England, every inch of land was owned and named and tamed. Here, the land stretched out into an unknown infinity. They saw whales playing in the bay, great beasts breaching and blowing plumes of mist into the cold air. It was a land of abundance, but it was also a land of mystery. However, there was a shadow over this arrival. As the ship sat quietly at anchor, a murmur of dissent began to ripple through the 'tween decks. It started among the strangers. They whispered that since they had not landed in Virginia, their contracts were void. They argued that they were now outside the jurisdiction of the king's charter. They said that when they went ashore, none had the power to command them. They could do as they pleased. They could strike out on their own. This was a terrifying prospect for the leaders. If the group splintered, they would all die. They were about to step into a wilderness in the dead of winter. They needed unity. They needed order. If every man was a law unto himself, chaos would follow. The leaders acted quickly. They did not use force. They used ink. They called the men into the great cabin. Imagine stepping from the cold, windy deck into the warm, confined space of the captain's quarters. The lantern cast a golden glow over the oak table. The stern windows looked out over the calm harbor. There they drafted a document. It was short, it was simple, but it was revolutionary. It was the Mayflower Compact. In this document, they agreed to combine themselves into a civil body politic. They agreed to enact laws for the general good of the colony. And most importantly, They agreed to obey those laws. It was a social contract. They were creating a government from scratch, based on the consent of the governed. One by one, the men stepped forward to sign. There were 41 signatures in total. The scratching of the quill on the parchment was the only sound in the room. It was a sound of binding. With every name added, the tension in the room dissipated. They elected John Carver as their first governor. The strangers and the saints were no longer two warring factions. They were a single community, bound by a shared promise. The ink dried, the lantern flickered, and peace was restored. With the laws established, it was finally time to explore the mysterious world awaiting them. On November 11th, the first expedition was launched. The longboat could not get all the way to the beach because of the shallow water. The men had to jump out and wade the last few yards. The water was freezing. It soaked their boots and breeches, turning instantly to ice as they stepped onto the sand. But they did not care. They were walking on solid earth. The women came ashore too, but they did not come to explore. They came to work. They brought bundles of dirty clothes that had been festering in the hold for 2 months. There on the freezing beach, they washed the linen in the cold salt water. It was the first Monday laundry in New England history. It was a gesture of civilization, a reclaiming of dignity. Meanwhile, Miles Standish gathered a group of armed men. They put on their steel corselets, which must have been biting cold against their shirts. They took their muskets and marched inland. The landscape was strange to them. It was a world of sand dunes and scrub oak. The wind whipped through the low bushes. The ground was covered in a carpet of dry leaves that crunched loudly under their heavy boots. They felt watched. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a footstep. They knew there were people here. They had seen smoke from the ship. They marched in a single file, alert and silent. They found fresh water springs bubbling up from the ground. After months of drinking sour beer and slimy water, the taste of the clear, cold spring water was like nectar. They drank deeply, dipping their faces into the pools. Further inland, they found a clearing. The ground had been disturbed. There were heaps of sand that looked man-made. They dug into them. Under the sand, they found woven baskets. And inside the baskets was treasure. It was corn, but not the wheat or barley they knew from home. It was Indian corn. The kernels were large and multicolored. There were reds and yellows and blues. It was beautiful. This presented a moral dilemma. They were hungry. Their supplies were running low. But this corn belonged to someone. It was a cache stored for the winter. To take it was theft, but to leave it might mean starvation. They debated right there in the clearing. In the end, necessity won. They filled a large iron kettle with the corn and filled their pockets, but they made a solemn vow. They promised that when they made contact with the owners, they would repay them in full. And to their credit, months later, they did just that. As they explored further, they saw figures in the distance. A group of Native Americans and a dog walking on the beach. The Pilgrims tried to follow them, but the figures vanished into the woods like ghosts. The forest seemed to swallow them up. It was a reminder that they were visitors in a land that others knew intimately. The sun began to set over the dunes, painting the sky in shades of violet and orange. The explorers returned to the ship, their pockets heavy with corn and their minds racing with what they had seen. They had found water. They had found food. They had found a place where they might survive. Eventually, after weeks of exploration, they chose a site across the bay to build their permanent settlement. They called it Plymouth, but the winter was already upon them. The winter of 1621 was not a season of battles or dramatic conquests. It was a season of quiet endurance. It was a siege of cold and sickness. They had arrived too late to build proper houses for everyone. Most of the passengers had to stay aboard the Mayflower, anchored in the harbor. The ship, which had been their vehicle, became their hospital. The sickness that struck them was a combination of scurvy and pneumonia and tuberculosis. It was aggravated by the cold and the damp and the poor diet. It moved through the ship like a silent predator. In the worst weeks of January and February, death was a daily visitor. Sometimes 2 or 3 people died in a single day. The 'tween decks, which had been filled with the sounds of arguments and children playing, fell silent. There were only the sounds of coughing and the hushed whispers of the dying. At one point, there were only 6 or 7 people who were healthy enough to move. Among them were Miles Standish and William Brewster. These men stood tall in the crisis. They did not shrink from the horror. They fetched wood. They made fires. They cooked meat. They washed the clothes of the sick. They dressed and undressed them. They performed the most humble and difficult tasks with a tenderness that no one expected from a soldier or a church elder. The death toll was staggering. Out of the 102 passengers who had arrived, half of them died. 50 souls. Families were shattered. Husbands lost wives. Parents lost children. It was a devastation that could have broken them completely. To hide their dwindling numbers from the Native Americans watching from the woods, they buried their dead at night. They rowed the bodies ashore to a place called Cole's Hill. They dug shallow graves in the frozen earth by the light of the moon. And then they leveled the ground and planted crops over the graves so that no one would know how many had fallen. It was a grim necessity, a secret grief. But even the longest winter eventually yields to the sun. In March, the wind changed. The biting gales from the north softened. The snow began to melt, revealing the brown earth beneath. Green buds appeared on the oak trees. The birds returned. The sound of the surf seemed less angry. And with the spring came contact. A native man named Samoset walked boldly into their camp and greeted them in broken English. Later came Massasoit, the great sachem. A peace treaty was signed. They were not alone anymore. They had allies. They learned how to plant the corn they had found. They learned how to catch eels in the river. On a bright day in April, the Mayflower prepared to leave. Master Jones had stayed through the winter to help them, but now his crew was recovering, and he had to return to England. The ship lay at anchor, her sails unfurled and drying in the warm sun. The captain offered passage to anyone who wanted to return. After the horror of the winter, after the death and the hunger, you might expect that many would want to leave. You might expect them to flee back to the safety of their old lives, but not a single pilgrim went back. They stood on the shore, watching the longboats ferry the last of the crew away. They were thin, their clothes were patched and worn. They were half the number they had been, but their resolve was iron. They had come to build a new world, and they would not abandon it. The anchor was weighed, the sails filled with a westerly breeze. The Mayflower began to move. She glided out of the harbor, getting smaller and smaller against the blue horizon. The connection to England was severed. The umbilical cord was cut. And so, as the sails of the Mayflower disappeared over the horizon, returning to England, the Pilgrims stood on the shore, no longer passengers, but inhabitants of a new world. They had endured the fury of the sea and the silence of the winter, bound together by a journey that changed them forever. It is a story of resilience that rests now in the pages of history. If you are still with me, I hope this tale has carried you far away from your daily cares. Now let us drift deeper into the quiet details of their world as the night settles in. Now that the great dramatic arc of the voyage has reached its conclusion, we may step back from the emotional trials of the passengers and turn our gaze toward the vessel itself. We leave behind the cold winds of the Atlantic and the uncertainty of the arrival to find a quiet space of contemplation. Here, in this epilogue, we shall settle into the comfortable, slow rhythm of understanding. We will explore the wooden world that contained them, the silent mathematics that guided them, and the intricate web of economics that made the journey possible. It is a time for the mind to rest on the details, to observe the mechanics of history with a detached and peaceful curiosity. Let us begin with the anatomy of the galleon. The Mayflower was not merely a vehicle, it was a masterpiece of 17th century carpentry, a floating fortress built from the forests of England to withstand the crushing weight of the ocean. To understand the ship, one must first understand the wood. The skeleton of the ship was crafted from English oak. This was not timber harvested in haste. The shipwrights of the era sought out specific trees, looking for oaks that had grown crooked in the wind, their branches bent by nature into the precise curves required for the knees and ribs of the hull. This natural curvature provided a strength that straight grain, steamed and bent by force, could never match. The wood was seasoned, left to dry and harden until it was as dense as stone, ready to hold the iron fasteners that would bind the structure together. The selection of these trees was a slow, deliberate process, carried out by master woodsmen who walked the forests of the Weald or the New Forest in winter when the sap was down. They looked for the crux and compass timber, the elbows of the great trees. Once felled, the timber would lie for years, curing in the air, allowing the moisture to evaporate slowly to prevent splitting. When you touch the side of a ship like the Mayflower, you are touching the ghosts of an ancient forest, trees that were saplings when the Plantagenets ruled England. If you were to stand upon the dock and look up at the high sides of the ship, your eye would be drawn to the castles. These were the defining silhouette of the galleon. At the front rose the forecastle, a high, box-like structure that loomed over the bow. Historically, these were defensive platforms, places for archers or musketeers to rain fire down upon an enemy deck. But on a merchant vessel like the Mayflower, the forecastle served as the living quarters for the crew, a dark and cramped space that smelled of wet wool and unwashed bodies. Here, the sailors slept in hammocks or on the deck, surrounded by the creaking timbers, directly above the crash of the bow wave. At the opposite end of the ship, rising even higher, was the aft castle. This structure tapered upward, narrowing as it rose, housing the officers and the captain. It gave the ship a high center of gravity, making it roll deeply in the swells. But it also provided the command staff with a view over the entire length of the deck. The great cabin, located in the aft sail, was the only space on the ship with windows, small leaded panes that looked out over the wake. It was a place of relative civilization amidst the wildness of the sea, where a table could be set and a chart could be spread. Jutting out from the prow of the ship, beneath the bowsprit, was the beakhead. This low, protruding platform extended over the water, guarded by rails but open to the spray of the sea. It was a remnant of the ramming beaks of ancient galleys, but here it served a more humble purpose. It was the location of the crew's latrines, the seats of ease, where the ocean itself provided the sanitation. It was a perilous place in a storm, slick with algae and foam, yet it was an essential part of the ship's daily life. Above the wooden hull rose the true engine of the vessel, the rigging. It is difficult to comprehend the sheer quantity of rope required to sail a ship of this size. There were miles of hemp cordage, ranging from the thick anchor cables, as wide as a man's thigh, to the thin, tarred lines used for lashing. This rope was not static. It was a living web that expanded when wet and shrank when dry, requiring constant adjustment. The standing rigging, the heavy shrouds that held the masts in place, was coated in thick black tar to preserve it against the salt spray. This tar, baked by the sun, gave the ship its distinctive scent, a sharp, earthy aroma that permeated the air for miles downwind. The rigging was manipulated through a system of blocks and pulleys. Hundreds of these wooden shells, carved from elm or ash, and fitted with lignum vitae sheaves, hung from the yards and masts. They allowed a handful of men to lift weights that would otherwise require an army. The sound of the wind in the rigging was a constant chorus, a hum that changed pitch with the velocity of the gale, accompanied by the rhythmic clattering of the blocks against the masts. And then there were the sails. They were woven from flax canvas, a heavy, durable fabric that was stiff and unyielding. When dry, the sails were manageable, catching the wind with a soft, drumming sound. But when wet, soaked by rain or spray, the canvas became incredibly heavy, freezing into stiff sheets of ice in the northern latitudes. The crew had to wrestle with this frozen fabric, their hands raw and bleeding, balancing high above the deck on foot ropes that swayed with the rolling of the ship. The Mayflower carried a specific arrangement of sails. There was the sprit sail, hanging beneath the bowsprit, dangerously close to the water. There were the great square sails on the foremast and mainmast, the workhorses of the Voyage. And on the mizzenmast, toward the rear, there was a triangular laden sail, allowing for better steering. Some galleons of this period even carried a fourth mast, the Bonaventure mizzen, with another small lateen sail to aid in maneuverability. Steering this massive structure was a feat of strength. There was no ship's wheel on the quarterdeck. That invention lay in the future. Instead, the helmsman stood in a small, enclosed space within the ship called the steerage. He controlled the rudder using a hipstaff. This was a long, vertical lever, a simple pole that came up through the floor. The bottom of the pole was attached to the tiller, the horizontal beam connected to the rudder outside. To turn the ship, the helmsman had to push or pull the hipstaff with his entire body weight. He could see very little of the sea. He steered by the feel of the ship, by the commands shouted down from the deck above, and by the compass illuminated in the binnacle before him. It was a blind, physical connection to the ocean, a dance of leverage and friction. Deep in the belly of the ship lay the ballast. A vessel like the Mayflower was top-heavy, with her high castles and heavy masts. To keep her upright, the bottom of the hull was filled with tons of stones, gravel, and coarse sand. This ballast had to be carefully balanced. If it shifted during a storm, the ship could capsize. The smell in the hold where the ballast lay was potent, a mixture of bilge water, rotting grain, and damp earth. This was the foundation upon which the entire voyage rested, the hidden weight that countered the force of the wind. Keeping the water out was an endless battle. The planks of the hull were not watertight on their own. The seams between them had to be caulked. This process involved driving strands of oakum-old rope that had been picked apart into fibers, into the gaps using a mallet and a caulking iron. Once the oakum was hammered in tight, the seam was sealed with hot pitch. The maintenance of the caulking was vital. As the ship twisted and flexed in the waves, the seams would work open, spitting out the oakum and allowing the sea to enter. The carpenter was constantly listening for the sound of trickling water, the ominous whisper of a leak. This wooden world, with its creaking ribs and singing ropes, was a marvel of pre-industrial engineering. It was built from the earth, from oak trees, flax plants, hemp fibers, and iron ore. Yet it was designed to conquer an element that was hostile to human life. The geometry of the masts against the sky, the slow groaning complaint of the rudder, the rough texture of the weathered planksol of these created a sensory environment that was completely unique. It was a floating island, self-contained and self-reliant, moving through the void. While the ship was a marvel of carpentry, navigating it required tools of brass and the stars above. Let us now turn our attention to the silence of navigation. How did they find their way across 3,000 miles of trackless waste, with no landmarks to guide them? In the year 1620, navigation was a blend of science, art, and intuition. It was a discipline of patience. The primary method used was known as dead reckoning. The term is deceptive in its simplicity. It required the navigator to keep a continuous, running mental calculation of the ship's position based on the course steered and the distance sailed. To know the distance, one had to know the speed. To measure the speed, they used the chip log. This was a simple, ingenious device. A wooden board, weighted on one edge to make it float upright in the water, was tied to a long reel of rope. Knots were tied in the rope at specific intervals. The process was rhythmic and ritualistic. A sailor would throw the wooden chip overboard. As the ship sailed away from the stationary piece of wood, the line would peel off the reel. Another sailor would hold a small sand glass, usually timed for 30 seconds. As the sand ran, the sailor counted the knots slipping through his fingers. When the sand ran out, he gripped the line. The number of knots that had passed out indicated the ship's speed in nautical miles per hour. This is why we still use the term knots for speed at sea today. The tactile sensation of the wet hemp line running through calloused hands was the primary data input for the ship's velocity. Time was the other variable in dead reckoning. There were no chronometers or precise mechanical watches on board. Time was measured by the hourglass. The ship's bell was rung every half hour, signaling the turning of the glass. A boy was usually stationed to watch the glass, turning it the instant the last grain of sand trickled through. If he was dreamy or slow, the ship's time would drift, and the calculations of longitude would become even more inaccurate. The sand trickling silently through the glass was the heartbeat of the voyage, measuring out the crew's shifts, or watches, in 4-hour increments. While speed and time could give an estimate of distance, finding the ship's latitude's position, north or south, required looking to the heavens. The primary tool for this was the cross staff. It looked like a wooden cross. The navigator would hold the main staff to his eye and slide the crosspiece along it until the bottom edge touched the horizon and the top edge touched the sun or the North Star. By reading the scale on the staff, he could determine the angle of the celestial body. However, staring directly at the sun was blinding, and using the cross staff on a pitching deck was notoriously difficult. It required a steady hand and a calm stomach. A more advanced instrument, the backstaff, was just coming into use. This allowed the navigator to stand with his back to the sun, using shadows to measure the altitude. It was easier on the eyes and generally more accurate. Every day at noon, if the sky was clear, the captain and the mates would gather on the quarterdeck with their instruments, squinting against the glare, trying to fix their position on the vast curve of the earth. Longitude, the position east or west, was the great unsolvable problem of the age. Because the earth rotates, determining longitude requires knowing the precise time at a known fixed point, like London, and comparing it to local time. Without accurate clocks, this was impossible. The Pilgrims and the crew had no way of knowing exactly how far west they had traveled. They could only guess based on their dead reckoning. They were sailing blind in the east-west dimension, hoping that their estimated distance was close to the truth. The compass was the soul of the ship's direction. It was housed in a wooden stand called the binnacle, located directly in front of the helmsman. Inside, the magnetic needle, attached to a card marked with the 32 points of the compass, floated in a bowl. At night, a small oil lamp inside the binnacle cast a warm, golden glow over the card, the only light allowed on the deck. The helmsman watched the swinging of the card, trying to keep the designated point aligned with the ship's centerline, fighting the push of the waves and the drift of the wind. The variation of the compass, caused by the difference between magnetic north and true north, was another variable the pilot had to account for, a ghostly error that changed as they crossed the ocean. To record all this data, the crew used a traverse board. This was a wooden board marked with holes arranged in the pattern of a compass rose. Every hour, the officer of the watch would place a peg in the hole corresponding to the direction the ship had sailed, and another peg to record the speed. At the end of the 4-hour watch, the data from the traverse board would be transferred to the ship's logbook. The quiet scratching of charcoal on paper, or the dip of a quill into ink, was the sound of history being recorded. Beyond the mathematics, there was the art of reading the sea itself. Experienced mariners, like Captain Jones, carried mental libraries of sensory data. They used rudders, or pilot books, which contained notes on tides, depths, and coastlines. But more than that, they watched the water. A change in the color of the ocean from deep indigo to a lighter green could indicate shoaling water. The presence of certain birds or floating seaweed could verify that land was near. The taste of the air, the shape of the clouds, the behavior of the swell-all, these were clues in a high-stakes detective game. The immersive details of this navigational dance are striking in their quietude. The golden glint of the brass compass housing, polished by years of handling. The soft, sifting sound of the sand in the hourglass. The rhythmic chanting of the leadsmen in the chains, swinging the lead weight to measure the depth of the water as they approached the coast. The captain, silent and focused, bracing his legs against the roll, seeking a connection with the stars. It was a precise, mathematical existence, played out against the chaotic backdrop of the wild Atlantic. Beyond the mechanics of the ship and the tools of navigation lay the economics that made the voyage possible. Ships do not sail on wind alone, they sail on money. The Mayflower voyage was a commercial enterprise, a higher-risk venture funded by men who expected a return on their investment. It is easy to think of the Pilgrims as purely spiritual seekers, but they were also partners in a complex business deal. The financing was organized by a group known as the Merchant Adventurers. These were not explorers, but investors, ironmongers, tailors, and merchants in London who pooled their capital to fund the expedition. The chief among them was Thomas Weston, a man of business who saw the potential for profit in the New World. The structure was a joint stock company. Investors bought shares in the company, and the funds were used to lease the ship, buy supplies, and hire the crew. It was the venture capital of the 17th century. The contract that bound the Pilgrims to these investors was harsh. It was a 7-year indenture. The settlers were not free to work for themselves. For 7 years, they had to work 6 days a week for the company. Everything they produced, furs, timber, fish, corn, belonged to the common stock. They were not allowed to own private land or work for personal profit until the 7-year term was up. In exchange, the company provided their passage and supplies. It was essentially a form of servitude, a heavy burden that weighed on the settlers long after they landed. This economic pressure explains the presence of the strangers. The London investors did not believe that the religious separatists alone had the skills to make the colony profitable. They insisted on adding other passengers to the manifest men with practical skills, soldiers, craftsmen, and servants. These were the strangers added to the ship to ensure the investment would yield a return. It was a marriage of convenience between the sacred and the profane, driven by the ledger book. The economy of the voyage and the early colony was conducted without currency. There were no banks in the wilderness, and silver coins were rare. Trade was conducted in commodities. The most valuable of these was the beaver pelt. The fur of the beaver was in high demand in Europe for the making of felt hats. A single pelt could buy substantial supplies. Timber was another export. The tall pines and oaks of New England were valuable in a deforested England. The settlers also traded corn with the indigenous people. The debt incurred by the Pilgrims was staggering. The cost of provisioning the ship was immense. Barrels of beer, firkins of butter, salted beef, dried peas, muskets, powder, tools, and clothing all had to be purchased at London prices. When the Mayflower sailed, the settlers were already deeply in the red. It would take them decades to pay off the merchant adventurers. They spent years laboring in the forests and on the sea, sending back cargo after cargo, often to see the value swallowed up by interest rates and fees. There were also legal complications regarding their patent. The original land grant they held was for the territory of Virginia, specifically the area around the Hudson River. By landing in New England, far to the north, they were technically squatters outside the jurisdiction of their patent. This created a legal vulnerability that plagued them for years and necessitated the writing of the Mayflower Compact to establish their own civil authority. Eventually, the relationship between the settlers and the London investors soured. The returns were too slow, and the investors were impatient. In 1648, many years after the landing, the settlers finally managed to buy out the investors. They took on the remaining debt themselves, liberating the colony from the control of the London merchants. It was a long, slow road to financial independence, paved with beaver skins and bushels of corn. The atmosphere of these financial dealings was a sharp contrast to the wild freedom of the ocean. It was an atmosphere of counting houses, of dust motes dancing in the light of high windows, of the rustle of parchment contracts. It smelled of wax seals and ink. It was the sound of coins clinking in bags, of heavy ledgers thudding onto tables, of quiet, intense discussions about risk and return. The investors knew that if a ship sank, their money was gone. There was no insurance. It was a gamble, a roll of the dice with human lives and wooden ships. And what of the Mayflower itself? Its fate is as quiet as the drift of the tide. The ship that carried the seeds of a nation did not end its days in a museum or a monument. It simply went back to work. After the winter of 1621, with the crew decimated by sickness and the settlers established on the shore, Captain Jones prepared the ship for the return voyage. He sailed in April. The return journey was remarkably fast. The westerly winds, which had fought against them on the way out, now filled the sails and pushed the ship home. The Mayflower crossed the Atlantic in just over a month, less than half the time of the outward voyage. She sailed up the Thames and docked in London, her great task completed. Captain Christopher Jones did not survive long after his return. The rigors of the voyage, the starvation, and the stress had likely taken a toll on his health. He died in 1622, just a year after returning. With his death, the primary advocate for the ship was gone. The Mayflower lay at her moorings in Rotherhithe, sitting idle in the muddy water of the Thames. In 1624, 2 years after the captain's death, the ship was appraised for probate. The records of this appraisal glimpse of her end. The surveyors described the ship as being in ruinas. She was old, rot was setting in, and she was no longer seaworthy. The total value of the ship was estimated at £128, 8 shillings and 4 pence. But here is the telling detail. The majority of that value was not in the ship itself, but in her fittings. The anchors, the cables, the sails, and the standing rigging were worth more than the hull. The great wooden body of the Mayflower, which had weathered the Atlantic storms, was worth little more than the price of firewood. The ship was likely broken up shortly after. This was the common fate of merchant ships. There was no sentimentality in the shipping business. A rotting ship was a liability. The ship was dismantled, plank by plank. The stout English oak, seasoned by salt and thyme, was pulled apart. The iron spikes were drawn out. The masts were unstepped. There is a persistent legend, a story that refuses to die, that the timbers of the Mayflower were used to build a barn in the village of Jordans in Buckinghamshire. This Mayflower barn still stands today. It is a quiet, dusty place. The beams are old, and some say they bear the markings of a ship. Whether it is truly the Mayflower is a matter of debate among historians, but the idea is a poetic one. It suggests that the wood that sheltered the Pilgrims from the ocean ended its days sheltering grain and hay from the rain, returning to the soil of England. In the port records of the time, the name Mayflower appears frequently. It was a common name for ships, as common as Seafoam or Enterprise might be today. There were many Mayflowers sailing out of English ports. This makes tracking the specific ship difficult. There is no definitive wreck site to dive, no sunken hole to explore. The ship simply dissolved. It was recycled, repurposed, and scattered. Let us linger for a moment on the specific sensation of the ship's end. Imagine the shipyard at Rotherhithe. It is a gray, overcast day. The river smells of mud and industry. Men with heavy crowbars are working on the hull of the old galleon. There is no ceremony. There is no speech given to honor the vessel's service. It is simply labor. The sound of wood splintering, of iron groaning as it is wrenched from the oak, fills the air. The castles that once loomed over the Atlantic swells are brought low, dismantled board by board. The beakhead, the ship was a living thing when the wind filled her sails, straining and flexing against the sea. Now she is dead weight. The life has gone out of the timber. What remains is just material. The anchors, those heavy iron symbols of hope, are sold to equip another ship, perhaps bound for the Mediterranean or the Baltic. The sails, if they are not too rotten, might be cut down to make tarpaulins or smaller sails for fishing boats. The Mayflower is not destroyed so much as she is distributed, her substance flowing back into the maritime economy of England. This lack of a physical monument forces us to rely on the Mayflower too, the replica built in 1957. When one walks the decks of that modern vessel, the reality of the confined space becomes overwhelming. The 'tween deck, where the passengers lived, feels impossibly small. The ceiling is low. A tall man must stoop. The lack of light is profound. By touching the rough wood of the replica, by smelling the Stockholm tar and the hemp, we can bridge the gap of centuries. It is a sensory echo, a way to physically place ourselves in the footprint of the past. But the true Mayflower exists only in the abstract. It exists in the ink of Governor Bradford's journal. It exists in the genealogies of the millions of descendants who trace their line back to that voyage. It exists in the name itself, which has become a synonym for new beginnings and hazardous journeys. The physical object is gone, but the vessel has become a vessel of history, carrying a cargo of memory that is far heavier than the casks of beer and butter she once hauled. Consider the silence of the barn in Jordan's. If those beams are indeed the ribs of the ship, they have found a peaceful retirement. Instead of the roar of the Atlantic and the screaming of the wind, they hear only the rustling of swallows in the eaves and the quiet breathing of cattle. The wood that was soaked in salt water for years is now dry and dusty. It has come full circle, from the forest to the sea and back to the farm. It is a gentle, pastoral ending for a ship that endured such violence. In the end, the story of the Mayflower is not just about the people. It is about the tools they used to change their world. It is about the adze that shaped the beams, the needle that sewed the sails, the compass that pointed the way, and the ledger that tallied the cost. These inanimate objects were the silent partners in the enterprise. They possessed no courage, no faith, and no ambition, yet without them, the courage and faith of the passengers would have been for nothing. The science of sailing in the 17th century was a triumph of empiricism. It was knowledge gained through hard experience, passed down from master to apprentice. There were no manuals that could teach a man how to feel the trembling of a mast under too much canvas. There was no chart that could capture the shifting sands of a harbor bar. It was a knowledge of the hands and the eyes, a somatic understanding of the physical world. As we close the book on this voyage, let us hold these images in our minds: the shape of the hull, round and bluff, pushing through the water; the intricate geometry of the rigging, a web of lines against the gray sky; the slow, rhythmic swing of the compass card, the scratch of the quill in the ledger, the silence of the rotting hulk in the Thames mud. The voyage is over. The passengers have disembarked. The ship has been unmade. The history is written, and the facts are laid to rest. Now, let us simply experience the atmosphere of the voyage one last time. The ledgers are closed, and the tools of navigation are put away in their velvet cases. The history of the Mayflower is a tapestry of courage and mechanics, wood and wind. We have explored the how and the why, leaving only the gentle rhythm of the experience itself. As we move to our final moments, let the facts drift away like mist on the water. The history books are closed now. The dates and the names have faded into the velvet darkness of the past. There is no longer a need to remember. no longer a need to learn. There is only the experience of the moment, the gentle, rhythmic reality of a ship at sea in the deep of the night. We have left the shore far behind, and with it the weight of the world. Here, in the vast embrace of the ocean, time slows down. It stretches out, becoming as wide and as deep as the Atlantic itself. We are drifting now, carried by the current and the wind, moving deeper into a state of profound rest. Let us settle into the rhythm of the hulls. The ship is not a silent thing. It is a living entity, crafted from the earth, and it speaks in a low, constant murmur. Listen closely to the sound of the wood. It is the sound of English oak, heavy and dense, flexing against the power of the water. It is a slow, rhythmic creaking. The timbers groan softly as the ship rolls, a sound that is not alarming but comforting. It is the sound of strength. It is the sound of the ship holding together, a wooden cradle rocking in the dark. Creak, sway, creak, sway. The sound travels through the beams, vibrating gently against the soles of your feet or against your back as you lie in the narrow bunk. It is a lullaby sung by the forest that birthed the wood. Can you hear the specific voice of the mainmast? It is a deeper note, a resonant bass tone that hums through the center of the ship. It is the spine of the vessel, rooted in the keel, reaching up to the stars. As the wind presses against the sails high above, the mast transfers that energy down into the hull, creating a steady, vibrating warmth. Outside the planking, mere inches away, is the water. Listen to the rush of the sea. It is a white noise, a continuous, shushing sound. It changes pitch as the ship rises and falls. When the bow dips down, the water rushes up to meet it is soft, splashing crescendo. Asterisk WHHH-USH asterisk. And then, as the bow rises, the water falls away, trickling and sighing as it drains from the scapucci. Asterisk hushy asterisk. It is the breath of the ocean, in and out, rising and falling. There is a lantern hanging from a beam above. Watch it in your mind's eye. It is made of pierced tin, old and battered, housing a thick tallow candle. As the ship rolls to the left, the lantern swings. The metal ring squeaks against the hook. Asterisk, squeak, asterisk. The shadow of the lantern travels across the wooden wall, a long, stretching shape that grows and shrinks. Then the ship rolls to the right. The lantern swings back. The shadow returns. It is a pendulum, marking the slow, sleepy passage of time. Back and forth. It is surrendering to the motion of the sea, just as you are surrendering to the pull of sleep. Feel the vibration of the rudder. It is a distant, dull shuddering at the very stern of the ship. The water fights against the wood, and the wood pushes back. This tension creates a low hum that permeates the aft cabins. It is a reminder that the ship is being guided, that there is a hand on the hipstaff holding the course. You do not need to steer. You do not need to watch the compass. Someone else is awake. Someone else is keeping the watch. You are free to let go the ropes, to have a voice. The miles of hemp rigging are stretching and relaxing. Listen to the soft asterisk, thump thump asterisk of a block tapping against the mast in a lull of the wind. Listen to the singing of the shrouds, the high-pitched whistle of the wind through the tight cordage. It is a harp, played by the breeze. The sounds are muffled, filtered through the thick oak planks of the deck above. They sound distant, like a memory of a sound. Occasionally, a wave slaps against the side of the hull. It is a dull thud, followed by the hiss of foam. It is the ocean knocking gently, asking to be let in, but the oak keeps it out. You are safe inside. You are dry. You are warm. The rain begins to fall, a light, pattering shower. You can hear the droplets striking the deck above your head. Asterisk, tip-tap, tip-tap, asterisk. It is a chaotic, gentle rhythm, distinct from the slow rolling of the ocean. The rain washes the salt from the wood, cleansing the ship, smoothing the night. Listen to the human sounds of the ship. They are the sounds of peace. There are the muffled, heavy footsteps of the watch crew walking the deck. Asterisk, thud, thud, dot dot, thud, asterisk, slow, deliberate paces. They are checking the lines, looking at the horizon. Their presence is a comfort. You are not alone. Around you, in the 'tween decks, is the sound of breathing, the slow, rhythmic inhalation and exhalation of sleeping passengers. It is a collective sigh. The ship breathes, the ocean breathes, and the people breathe. Everything is synchronized. The feeling of being cradled is absolute. The ocean lifts the ship up, gently, slowly, and then lowers it down. It is the most primal of sensations. It is the rocking of a cradle. It bypasses the conscious mind and speaks directly to the body. Your muscles relax. The tension in your shoulders dissolves. The weight of your head sinks into the pillow. The sway is hypnotic. To the left, dot dot dot, pause, dot dot. To the right, dot dot dot, pause. The world is fluid. There are no sharp edges here, only curves and cycles. The darkness outside the hull is infinite. If you were to look out a porthole, you would see nothing but the black water merging with the black sky. But inside, in the warm, dim light of the lantern, the shadows are soft. They dance on the walls, blurring the grain of the wood. Your eyelids feel heavy. They want to close. The visual world is fading, replaced by the sound of the creaking timber and the rushing water. The deep, resonant thrum of the ocean is vibrating in your chest, slowing your heart rate, matching it to the rhythm of the waves. Let us drift now, up from the warm, creaking hold, and float like a spirit up the companionway stairs. We emerge onto the open deck. The air changes instantly. It is cool, crisp, and clean. We are standing on the quarterdeck, looking out at the universe. It is the celestial watch. In the year 1620, there is no light pollution. There are no cities glowing on the horizon, no electric lights to dull the heavens. The world is truly dark, and because of this, the sky is truly bright. Above you, the dome of the night is shattered with diamonds. The stars are not just points of light, they are blazing fires, thick and dense. Look up, directly overhead. The Milky Way stretches like a rift in the fabric of the night. It is a solid cloud of light, a river of milk spilled across the obsidian sky. It is so bright that it casts a faint, ghostly shadow on the deck. You can see the dark dust lanes within it, the swirling eddies of galaxies far beyond our comprehension. It is a roof of infinite depth. Watch the slow rotation of the constellations. To the north, hanging low over the water, is Ursa Major, the Great Bear, the drinking gourd. Its stars are bright and steady. They are the guardians of the pole. Follow the line of the 2 pointer stars, and you find Polaris, the North Star. It is the anchor of the sky, the one fixed point in a spinning world. The ship may roll, the waves may crash, but Polaris remains still. It is the eye of the needle through which the ship is threading its course. To the east, rising, dripping from the sea, is Cassiopeia, the queen. Her W shape is tilted on its side. She is ascending, bringing with her the promise of the dawn. though the dawn is hours away. The stars are so numerous that the familiar shapes are almost lost in the background clutter of the infinite. There are stars here that have no names, stars that have not been seen by human eyes for centuries. Look down at the water. The ocean is a mirror. The sea is calm tonight, a sheet of polished black glass. The reflection of the stars rides on the surface. As the ship cuts through the water, it slices through the constellations. You are sailing through the sky. The boundary between the air and the water has dissolved. There is no up or down, only the sphere of the night. A moon is rising now. It is a waning crescent, a sliver of silver bone hanging low in the east. It is not bright enough to drown out the stars, but it casts a path of light across the waves. The moon road. It glitters and dances, 1,000 sparks of silver shifting with the water. The wake of the ship catches this light, glowing with a phosphorescent fire. Every now and then, a shooting star streaks across the blackness. It is a sudden, silent scratch of light burning up in the upper atmosphere. It is there, and then it is gone, leaving a momentary afterimage on your retina. It is a wish waiting to be made. But there is nothing to wish for. You have everything you need. You have the ship, the sea, and the sleep. The vastness of the celestial dome is humbling. It puts the ship in perspective. The Mayflower is a tiny speck, a chip of wood floating in a void. But this is not a frightening thought. It is a peaceful one. You are small, and therefore you do not have to carry the weight of the universe. The universe is carrying you. The sky is a blanket tucked in at the corners of the horizon, keeping you safe. The peace of the night watch is absolute. The sailor standing at the rail is a silhouette, a statue carved from shadow. He is not speaking, he is just watching. He is listening to the silence of the universe. It is a silence so deep that it has a sound of its own, a high, thin ringing, like the vibration of a crystal glass. It is the sound of the spheres. The unity of sea and sky is complete. The horizon line has vanished in the dark. You are floating in a bubble of space. The cool air fills your lungs, tasting of ozone and starlight. It is a clean, purifying breath. You are inhaling the night. You are exhaling the day. Let the visual fade now. Close your eyes, even in this dream. Let the stars blur into a soft haze. We will navigate now by scent. We will explore the olfactory landscape of the ship, the invisible cloud of aroma that travels with it across the ocean. Breathe in through your nose, deeply, slowly. The first scent is the most powerful, the smell of the ship itself. It is the smell of old oak. It is a dry, woody, dusty scent, like the inside of an antique chest. It is the smell of history. Mixed with this is the sharp, acrid tang of pine tar. The pitch that seals the seams, the tar that coats the rigging, it has a medicinal, resinous quality. It clears the head. It is the smell of preservation. It smells of forests and sunlight trapped in amber. Layered over the wood is the smell of the sea. But it is not just salt. It is more complex. It is the scent of brine, a savory mineral richness. It is the smell of drying kelp, of iodine, of deep water. When the spray hits the deck and dries in the wind, it leaves a crust of white salt. You can smell this crystallization. It is a crisp, clean scent, sharp and invigorating. It cuts through the heavy air of the hold. Drift closer to the galley. There is no fire burning now, but the bricks of the hearth are still warm. There is a faint, lingering ghost of a smell. Baking bread. It is a warm, yeasty, comforting aroma. It triggers a memory of home, of safety, of nourishment. It is the smell of life. Perhaps there is also the scent of dried herbs hanging in bundles from the beams, rosemary, thyme, sage. They release their oils slowly into the air, creating a subtle, earthy perfume. Move into the passenger quarters. The air here is warmer, thicker. It smells of wool, damp wool, drying in the warmth of the bodies. It is a musky, animal scent, but it is not unpleasant. It is the smell of the flock. It is the smell of blankets pulled up tight against the chin. It smells of beeswax candles that have recently been snuffed out, that distinct, sweet, smoky aroma of the wick dying. There are old leather trunks stacked in the corners. You can smell the leather, rich and tanned. It smells of libraries and saddle shops. It suggests travel, durability, and protection. Now, step back out into the rain. The rain has a scent. It smells of ozone and wet canvas. The flax sails, soaked with fresh water, release a smell like wet linen, like laundry on a line, but heavier. It is the smell of the atmosphere washing the world. The air is heavy with moisture. You can taste it on your tongue. It is fresh, devoid of the dust and smoke of the land. It is the cleanest air you have ever breathed. The combination of these scents, wood, tar, salt, wool, wax, and rain, creates a unique olfactory signature. It is the scent of the voyage. It is a comforting heaviness that settles in the lungs. It tells your brain that you are in a specific place, a place designed for endurance and rest. The soothing aroma of the pitch is a sedative. The cleanliness of the sea breeze is a tranquilizer. The warmth of the sleeping quarters is a blanket for the mind. The smells begin to fade into the background. You stop noticing them as distinct notes. They blend into a single, warm, encompassing atmosphere. The sensory experience is becoming still. You are no longer analyzing the environment. You are simply existing within it. We move now to the final visualization. We are floating above the ship, looking down, and then pulling back, watching it move across the surface of the black ocean. We are witnessing the infinite horizon. The line where the sea meets the sky is usually the definition of the world's edge. But tonight, there is no line. There is only a gradient of darkness, shifting from the deep indigo of the water to the charcoal of the sky. The ocean is timeless. It has been here for billions of years, rolling and heaving, long before this wooden ship carved a path through it. It will be here long after the ship is gone. This thought is not terrifying. It is relieving. The ocean is eternal. It is patient. It can hold you. See the ship as a tiny speck of warmth in the cool vastness. It is a lantern sliding across a dark mirror. It is moving forward, always forward. The motion is continuous. There is no stopping, no pausing. The wind pushes, the sails catch, the hull slides. It is a state of perpetual flow. Look at the water at the bow. It parts willingly. The cutwater slices through the surface, peeling back the waves in two long, curling ribbons of white foam. The water hisses as it is pushed aside, then rushes back together behind the stern. The wake trails out behind the ship, a long, fading scar of turbulence that slowly smooths itself out. The ocean heals itself instantly. The path we have traveled disappears, leaving no trace. There is only the present moment, the point of the bow cutting the dark. The deep blue of the water turns to black as you look deeper. It is the color of sleep. It is the color of heavy velvet curtains drawn against the day. The slow passage of time is marked only by the distance traveled. But there are no milestones here. No trees, no hills, no towns, only the water. One wave looks like the next. This repetition is the key. Wave after wave after wave. Mile after mile after mile. The horizon is blurring. Your focus is softening. The visual details are melting away. The white wake glowing in the moonlight becomes a soft smudge of light. The sound of the water lapping becomes a rhythmic hush, asterisk, hush, dot dot dot, hush, hush, asterisk. The gentle rocking motion eases the body into a state of total surrender. You are floating, you are weightless. The absence of land is a blessing. Land is where the work is. Land is where the noise is. Here, there is only the fluid element, the eternal sleep of the sea. The ocean is a giant, breathing organism, and you are resting on its chest. It rises and falls, rises and falls. The consciousness is fading into the waves. The thoughts that once raced through your mind are now slowing down, matching the speed of the ship. They are drifting away, like leaves dropped into the wake, left behind in the dark. You do not need them where you are going. You are going into the deep. The voyage continues. On and on, into the peaceful dark. The ship is a cradle. The sea is a lullaby. The stars are the nightlight. The destination is rest. And so the ship sails on, a vessel of dreams, drifting on a sea of stars. The journey is long, the water is calm, and the night is kind. The wood creaks its gentle song, the ropes hum their quiet tune, and the ocean whispers its ancient promise of sleep. The lantern swings, the shadows dance, and the eyes close. Thank you for traveling with me tonight, across the years and across the ocean. We have weathered the storms and found the calm. We have built the ship and sailed the stars. From all of us here at Sleeping Scribe, we wish you a peaceful rest. May your own voyages be safe and your sleep be deep.